more of a result than I did, didn't you?
Not much more of a result, yeah. So, good morning, and welcome to the first non-keynote presentation of Learning Technologies 2011. In putting together the session today, Don and I had a long conversation around how the best way to try and structure something was, and we decided that actually what would be really, I think, relevant would be to have kind of two very different perspectives around what's going on in terms of learning technology market and how it may be for you as organizations to think around how you engage with it. So I get the job of giving the helicopter view in many ways, or sitting on the top of a rock admiring the long view, I suppose, in talking around some of the biggest shifts that are taking place that we see from our research. And David is going to follow on and talk about some of the more practical, if I can put it in those terms, things to consider when actually looking at selection and vendor options and so on. So in terms of let's just check this works, my subject matter, this comes from really our research process with large corporate organizations. We've been involved in looking at this for probably 15 years or so. And a lot of the view that we have is based on understanding the deeper experiences and realities within large FTSE 100 companies, large multinationals, the EMEA end of US Fortune 500 companies and similar. And within that, there are a number of really big areas from a systems perspective we still see as influencing the decisions that organizations are making today. And I think the first and most important statement to make is that organizations, large corporates, are absolutely re-engaging today in 2011 with rethinking what their learning technology architectures for the future are. So whereas maybe 2 years ago when the economic crisis hit, a lot of organizations kind of, the strategic thinking, the strategic LMS projects, what are we doing going forward, what's the next generation architecture, disappeared off the agenda for a while, basically because nobody wanted to spend money. What they've gone through is a period of a year, 12, 18 months, where they've gone through that process, and now they've come out the other side thinking, okay, we need to do this differently. There's a lot of transformation agenda around things like the learning function globally, HR functions globally, and there's a lot of change going on. And what we're seeing is a lot of activity that's kicked off probably in the second half of last year and into this year, starting to rethink what that architecture looks like. Some of the things I wanted to touch on today are, first of all, to elevate the conversation slightly, rather than just focusing on learning as a specific, what I've described as a silo area in its own right. Clearly, one of the things in corporates that massively impacts this discussion around systems is the broader HR or human capital systems discussion, not least the answers SAP, now what's your question, which again we're seeing in nearly all organizations. I also want to talk about the shift away from thinking about platforms as software to platforms as service. And that doesn't just mean software as a service, that's a piece of that, but actually just thinking around how, for example, learning management is delivered, how learning content processes are delivered as a service model across an organization rather than thinking about selection of just software platforms. And then via a diversion around some things around the shifting ecosystem for learning, in other words, moving away from a fairly binary view of classroom training and e-learning towards a much more complex version of what the ecosystem for learning needs to look like. I want to talk about a few sub-trends, including things like pull tools and LMSs and so on. So that's my intent. Let's start with the top level. This is a diagram, a simplification of a model you'll find Gartner talk about models like this. You'll talk Forrester and so on, some of the US IT analysts. When you look at the whole kind of human capital space, they tend to basically divide in what we might call core or transactional HR system. We'll insert words like SAP, PeopleSoft, Oracle, etc. But also, Lawson, Northgate, whoever you want to put in that. And a whole bunch of relatively historically siloed areas fairly discrete areas which now make up a broader discussion around an integrated or a talent management view of things. So what we talk about is transformational talent silos and then the transactional HR thing that underpins that. Okay? When we started life, go back 10 years, and you spent, or your organization may have committed to spend $100 million or something or similar on Oracle or SAP or whatever to do this, the assumption was it was also going to do that as well. So when the scope of these systems, and one of the key dynamics we see in large corporates is an assumption that historically, and it is absolutely an assumption, that whatever they used for this was justified on the basis that the aggregated spend meant that it would also roll over and it would be doing recruitment, it would be doing learning. So it said, when you look at the grand SAP story, it said on the thing it managed training as well, it does performance as well, it does recruitment as well, and the assumption was that that was going to be what was going to be delivered. Okay? So that dynamic has existed around the learning technology market, because obviously in learning technology we live in this one space here for 15 years. I wrote our first paper on it in 2001, talking about what was the relevance of the HR systems to that space. And there was a clear assumption in organizations, and it goes through a 3 to 5 year itch cycle, where even when you make maybe a best of breed decision for your recruitment platform or performance platform or learning management platform, 3 years later it comes back and said, yeah, but we're going to move it to SAP. That's still strategically our assumption. So that dynamic is there in nearly all organizations. The reality has been that typically these solutions have been dominated by best-of-breed players. So in the learning management market and in the learning technology market, we talk about organizations, SumTotal, Saba, Plateau, Cornerstone. Niche, specific vendors whose primary focus has been providing learning management systems, not in providing any grand ERP solution. Now what's also happened was that these guys, the silo players, have suddenly realized that actually they don't really want to be just a learning management provider. They actually want to be a unified or an integrated talent management system provider. So SumTotal buys Softscape. Taleo, which is a leading e-recruitment company, buys Learn.com. There is a split of offerings. So there are not only strategic alliances, there's a lot of acquisition activity amongst these vendors to build that. Now this has a huge impact on the decisions that organizations are making around who their strategic suppliers are, not just for learning systems, but also for the broader landscape. Does that make sense? The other factor that's impacted that is when we look across those silos, you'll find that nearly all of the main vendors, or the vendors with the most momentum, or the business shift within each of those vendors is dominated by software as a service. So the idea of buying a solution on a subscription basis that is hosted for you, is supported for you, is upgraded for you automatically as part of it, rather than installing it on your infrastructure internally. We're also starting to see a push into the HR system space as well. Gartner's own analysis of the HR management market, 70% of which, 70% in the enterprise market of this is called SAP or Oracle. Okay? Huge domination. But their analysis of that is that behind firewall HR is within its end-of-life cycle. Now, it's got a very long tail, but it's in its end-of-life cycle. And that SaaS-based HR, enterprise HR, is within 2 years of being early majority, effectively. So in other words, there's a big shift in interest towards software as a service in the HR systems marketplace. Now, interestingly enough, when you look at this on a software as a service basis, as long as these players play together, you're concerned about there being one answer. The equivalent of the answers SAP, now what's the question, is much less, because they're more designed to be a plug-and-play environment. And for example, Workday, which is the leading sort of push into here, there's also people like Ultimate Software and so on. That organization doesn't have a learning management platform, it partners. it doesn't have a recruitment platform, it partners, and so on. So they're building a almost software as a service ecosystem around what they're doing. How does that impact some of the specific things? So moving on, just talking about, for example, LMS. Historically, as I said, the LMS agenda has been dominated by buying software, typically from an LMS vendor, sometimes also from e-learning providers. A good example of that will be someone like Skillsoft, who will have sold their Skillport platform to a lot of organizations as a delivery vehicle to deliver the content, and sometimes by these HRMS or ERP players. Now, what's happening there, we can put some names in them just as some examples, is, as I've already said, when we looked at the silos, there's a big shift away from a software-driven model towards a service-driven model. Now, that doesn't mean it's just by people like CornerstoneLearn.com and Geo. Both Geo and Learn.com, of course, have been bought recently. But these guys on the left-hand side have also significantly shifted. So in 2007, Plateau basically redescribed its business model to be a SaaS-based learning and talent systems provider. When you look at the business now for organizations like Saba and SumTotal, a significant proportion of their revenue is now based on a software as a service delivery model. So there's a big shift that's happened there. The other shifts that's also happened is that there's been increased interest in things like managed learning. So almost all of the large corporate organizations we talk to, somewhere in the discussion within their overall kind of strategy is a managed service discussion. So can they, for example, push out administration of their classroom training provision, et cetera, to a third-party organization? And of course, what's happening here is that some of the players in this space, the e-learning space, are crossing across into the managed service layer, as well as some of them coming back. When we looked at the organizations who mainly deliver this stuff, so when you say who implemented SAP or Oracle for you, a lot of the time it's large aggregator organizations, Accenture and IBM being good examples, or ACS, and those are also pushing back, of course, into this space. So there's a lot of change going on, but not least the fact of rethinking this as not being about software, more thinking about service, number one, and then behind that, not thinking about just as learning, but thinking about learning within that talent discussion and how that relates back to your HR platform. Within learning itself, of course, there's been a change. So, there's lots of stuff. There's a session that's running parallel to this that's talking about this explicitly. But obviously, this whole thing about going from really a model driven by formal learning towards a model where formal learning is only a part of it. So the growth of a shift in focus away from, whether you want to call that 70, 20, 10, or whatever the model you're doing, away from just the formalized components of this towards much more of an on-demand, more holistic model of what learning looks like. Now, I'm not going to talk about that in too much detail, but in essence, when you look at the components, so we've still got our formal classroom training, our formal e-learning in here. With the growth of these things on the right-hand side, there is a significant change in the kinds of systems that we need to support it. Now, that's what's leading to this discussion, is the LMS dead? Because there are a number of people that are mainly on this side, not least the people advocating a social learning model, who also have a vested interest in creating a position or a dynamic around actually the fact that this should all now be about, say, a social learning approach and not about formal learning. The reality of that in corporates is completely different, okay? That social learning is an important direction, but at the moment it's a small and experimental direction. No organization we're working with has less focus on its compliance agenda today than it had last year. Everybody's got more focus on compliance, but they also want to focus on this stuff as well. So the reality is the outcome of that is that the management of formal learning, the processes to support that, and therefore the LMS is still as important as it's always been. The other thing that hasn't changed is, and I could ask this as a question, how many of you have got more budget for your administration and management of learning than you had last year? Everybody has a focus on reducing overhead costs, on getting more value for money out of what they're doing, on rationalizing their suppliers and so on. So the focus is around the core, doing this formalized learning are just as strong as ever, if not more, but there's a much more diverse set of needs associated with it. Those needs must be incorporated within the core systems as well. Okay, if you have a strategy that is around creating add-on technologies, not least around a learning portal, that provides the other stuff, then that strategy fundamentally will not be sustainable longer term. You have to bring that into the core of the learning systems provision. What does that mean in learning architecture terms? Well, a lot of what we've talked about is a big diversity, increasing diversity around the delivery and content types, okay? And a shift away from just formal learning at the top level to focusing on things like competencies, communities, etc. And then within that, to add on a number of different things. So some of the key sub-changes, I think, within the kind of learning architecture are around things like learning portals. Okay, the renaissance of learning portals. Suddenly they've become a big deal again. 5-6 years ago, learning portal was quite a common thing, and then effectively it's sort of more of a back seat. Now it's back on the front seat again. Next generation learning management, I've talked about social learning. And the other thing I want to just quickly touch on is a bit around open source, because I think that's a relevant consideration as well. So learning portals, I described it as a renaissance. Okay, what we've seen is that nearly every large organization that we are both in part of our corporate research network or we're working with on an advisory level is looking at how they create a much more compelling front-end user experience. David will talk about this a little bit more within his content. You know, how do we create something that is easy for people to use, that delivers to the content that we want to them within a few clicks, that is relevant to them rather than here's the catalog, go and find it. So portal is a key addition. The view of that is a more connected view. It's a more personalized view. As I said, I want it to be relevant to me. I want role-based content, for example, learning plans that are relevant to me. So the demand to create and deliver those is much greater now. There's a technology shift. If I could paraphrase this in one word, it is, I want it to be like Amazon. Okay? What people are saying around that is they don't want to see a structured LMS interface. They certainly don't want to see anything that looks like an ERP platform. What they want to see is Amazon. But Amazon for learning, with ratings, with comments, with preferred stuff that is relevant to you. You know, when you go in and it says, David, you might like to look at these books, or here's some special offers that are relevant to you. So the demand, the shift around the thing is about creating a much more compelling user experience and also a more inclusive experience. So this is not just about, I can now register on a course. It is, here are these 10 things that may be relevant to what you want to do. And one may be an e-learning course, some of them might be some PDFs, some of them might be some links to some other experts or a community or a discussion or whatever it's going to be. So creating a much richer experience around it. Underpinning that is, as I said, a shift in and the next generation of what the LMS does. Historically, the LMS is primarily for around automating the administration processes around formal training, number one. And number two is a platform for delivery and tracking and reporting of e-learning content. Now, if I go back to my ecosystem slide, that covered about 2 slices of that spectrum, that ecosystem. So how does the LMS grow to incorporate some of those things? The proliferation of learning resources and types. Okay? And when I look in that world, tracking is more than SCORM. Right? SCORM and AICC tells me completion, maybe mastery tests and so on. But actually the question, this is one of the reasons the death of LMS question keeps coming up is, you know, if I'm talking about giving somebody access to a set of resources and a discussion, what relevance is SCORM to that? You know, and that actually has got turned into what relevance is an LMS. And that's the wrong question, because the LMS is relevant for all sorts of other reasons. The question is, how do we incorporate some of these other pieces in them, and what does tracking now mean for them? Because believe me, on the internet, everybody talks about whether Google and everything else, on the internet, everything is tracked. Okay? It's just not a completion or a mastery test. So what I need is a much more holistic view of tracking and reporting, and I need it to encompass lots more than just the formal training elements. That demand has not gone away. Also within that world, search is much more critical, because now I don't want a catalogue view. I want to be able to see anything that's relevant to what I'm asking for, and I need to be able to select what's relevant. So again, that's behind we'll use Google as your LMS. Well, Google is only the LMS if I've got stuff behind it, pipes behind it to deliver it and manage that. So what are the pipe system? What am I using to do that? And that's where that next generation LMS fits in. What about social? So there are people speaking, actually as we speak, who in other sessions that for some time have been advocating the fact that social learning is a critical and important dynamic that will replace a lot of your formal learning systems. Personally, I'm a big supporter of the social learning story and the potential for that to add value and extend the formal learning system. But in very few places does it replace it. As I said before, there's more focus on compliance, not less, in organisations. We still have to do that formal stuff there well. There's also more focus on competence and talent process now, not less. That involves a kind of capability, structured model approach to it that will require that to be built, again, into the system. Social learning adds to that. It extends it. In some cases, it may actually be a principal mechanism for you to build that capability in an organisation, but it is an addition. So the reality, therefore, is how do we add to the previous story, not replace the previous story because of this? And that's a really fundamental thing to understand, I think, in terms of it. There is no organisation that is replacing its core LMS platform and turning it off and just doing a social learning platform instead. The reality is most of the corporates, this is still experimental. Okay? There is even a big debate as to who owns it, whether it's owned by, whether learning really owns this at all, or in fact, actually it's going to be IT and your the collaboration people within IT who are going to go out and define, just like they did with email, what social tools will be available, and that learning will then have to hook to those rather than replace them. So this is an important dynamic, but it is not, the answer for most organisations is not going to be deploying these kinds of tools, unless that's part of their enterprise architecture. The right-hand one, by the way, is the Lotus Connections platform, in case anybody was wondering. So an important dynamic, but actually not a dominant dynamic. Okay? It will be additional, not replacement. Of course, there's another side to this whole collaboration and social thing, which is Sharepoint. How many of your organizations are deploying Sharepoint currently in them? Okay. So when we ask that in a corporate context, we probably get a 90% answer plus. And Sharepoint is kind of a bit of a silver bullet. It's actually a very interesting tool, but it's a tool now supported by IT, pushed across the organization, and in many ways it's a solution looking for problems to solve. And actually, because of the nature of Sharepoint, it can do content management, it can do discussions, it's a very flexible environment. Actually, what that means is it can actually help in lots of areas. So what we're seeing is a huge proliferation, almost an uncontrolled proliferation of it within organizations. And it's being pushed now as the portal solution, it's being pushed as informal learning platforms, it's being pushed as almost anything you can think of. And the reality is very different. First of all, Sharepoint, even Sharepoint 2010, is not actually an ideal tool for many of the things that we want to do. It's just the tool that's available. Okay? Secondly, is because there is no strategy behind it, other than the proliferation of it for its own purpose, then actually there is no governance of what's being done. And certainly in a learning context, what we would see in a large multinational company is lots of people creating learning portals, for example, in Sharepoint, that kind of half connect to their underlying LMS tools. Right? But they're not doing it once with a common framework. They're probably doing it 20 times across the business. Okay? And each one of those is probably fairly poorly designed and integrated. We were with one major company, global multinational, and I was talking to their head of academies, and he said, yeah, I've got a guy on the end of the phone who's designing it for me. When we asked what was the spec for their learning portal, he's got a guy on the end of the phone. There was no spec. He was just kind of doing it. And that kind of story is happening all over the place. So SharePoint is relevant, but it's not the answer in many cases. It will be part of the answer because almost by definition, I think SharePoint, when you look at the portal applications layer, SharePoint will take a fairly dominant position in that in many companies. Okay? But as I said, from a learning perspective, it's not necessarily an ideal, and it doesn't necessarily integrate or fit with the other pieces of the architecture, e.g. with the LMS and so on. Final point I wanted to touch on is around open source. How many of you are using Moodle? Okay. So if I asked that question even 2 years ago, I would have got a few hands up, and they would have largely been from academic institutions. Now what we've started to see is a huge shift in interest in tools like Moodle, and behind that, a broader interest in open source. So there's been a big growth in the awareness of open source options, and the majority of that in reality is in Moodle. So if you start talking to people like Dokios and Sakai and stuff like that, the reality is that's not playing in the agenda. It's Moodle that is the main area of interest in the learning system space, of course. And part of the reason for that is, number one, because people have been looking at other options for LMSs because they've been expensive. Moodle's been positioned as an LMS, even though in reality it isn't. Okay? The majority of organizations, and we've done some research, which hopefully we'll publish next month. I say that because I said it was supposed to publish it last year, around the corporate use of Moodle. And the reality is, in most cases, it's an e-learning launch and track vehicle and a portal system. It's not managing classroom training processes, mainly because actually it doesn't do that very well. It's not being used to manage developmental processes because it doesn't do that at all. It doesn't even do a lot of the team, the manager interface or any of those kinds of things. Groups, assignments, there's so many things it doesn't do. Okay? An interesting evolution of that is on there you'll notice the logo for Totara, which is Kineo's new offering, where they've basically taken some of the customizations they've developed for Moodle and built that in to make it more suitable for a corporate environment. So this is going to make a big difference. If you are a low to middle-end LMS provider, this is a big deal because actually it's providing a very aggressive kind of competition at the moment. But if your organization's thinking about it, think about these three things at the bottom. What is your role? As I said, Moodle is not really an LMS, but it can do other elements of that very well. So what do you want this to do, and is it suitable? Secondly, what's your supply chain and service model? Who are you buying it from? The majority of Moodle providers really mainly operate in the academic market. They're small organizations. The Moodle Partner Network is designed to make sure that they don't operate across multiple geographies. So if you are a multinational company, that inherently should spell some big concerns for you and problems. And the other thing is think about the total cost of ownership question. At the end of the day, it's not just about free software, which is the kind of thing that makes it attractive. It's how much you then spend over the lifetime of your use of that on services and hosting and everything else that goes with that. And the reality is there are organizations, corporate organizations, which have adopted Moodle, the licensing for which is very attractive, but the service cost, how much they're spending on customization and consulting support is very high. So you think about it in the whole arena. So we talked about the ERP and HR and the relevance of there, the shift in spectrum there. We've talked about some of the shift within learning. What I'd like to do now is to hand over to David, who is going to talk to you maybe about some very practical things around how you should look at what you're doing and the options for selection and of potential vendors.
We'll take questions at the end of the whole session, if that's okay. And just while David's swapping the box and swapping the PC, just to let you know, David's been involved in e-learning for 12 years now. He's responsible for corporate and vendor research process at eLearnity, but previously he was head of learning solutions and technology at Virgin Media and implementing their strategy. So, David.
Okay, what I've got to do is take you through my presentation deck, really related to the key steps in selecting systems and suppliers. And